The EasternKicks podcast is brought to you in association with Guelo Beer. Use discount code EK10 at guelobeer.co.uk or guelobeer.com and get 10% off your order every time. Hello and welcome to the EasternKicks podcast, a regular magazine programme about East Asian film led by me, Andrew Heskins, founder and grandmaster of easternKicks.com, and James Mudge, our leading writer.
Hey up.
Each episode we'll be taking a look at the latest films, news and festivals, often chatting to filmmakers and stars along the way. It's that time of year again, when the clocks turn back and the nights draw in. Nope. I'm not talking about the end of British summertime. It's lunchtime here. There's something very strange going on. It's another special Halloween edition. And this time we're looking at some of the best in Hong Kong horror, from the 1980s to the present day. Meanwhile, Niina and Stephen share some thoughts on their favourites. But firstly, let's get on to that important question. What are you drinking this episode, James?
Well, since it's Halloween, I'm drinking blood orange gin straight, which is actually, it's orange. It's not blood coloured at all. But I think that's quite creepy, man. And it's straight spirits.
That's probably creepier than anything.
How about you? What are you on, man?
I've got a Howling Hops that I put away in the cupboard for quite a long time. It's called Smoothing Fidelity, which doesn't necessarily sound like a particularly scary brew.
Strange name.
But it is an unadulterated imperial stout and 10.5%. Now that's where the scares come in.
That truly is unadulterated. Oh, very nice. Let's get it poured. There we go. This seems healthier, I think. I'm assuming there's real orange.
There's real fruit in there, obviously.
Yeah, they just squeeze blood orange into gin, I'm sure. But well, here's to it. That'll do it.
And on to Hong Kong horror.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about it this episode, James?
Well as it being Halloween, I think this is, for better or worse, kind of a fitting time to be talking about Hong Kong horror with the real horrors which have been happening of the national security law and everything. Which, we say the horrors, but I guess, like everyone else, to be fair, we don't really know what it means. Whether it's going to really mean mainland censorship coming to Hong Kong, which I guess kills the horror film. Whether it's going to be applied to the past retrospectively films, we don't really know or anything, and that confusion is not going to be helpful anyway. But certainly for guys like us, I think for a lot of our younger listeners, of which I'm sure there are many, it's all like the K horror and the J horror, which is the kind of the ruling the roost these days, and for quite I guess since the 2000s. But for guys like us, I guess, and for quite a lot of others, Hong Kong horror would have played such an important part in our cinematic development and everything. No, from whether we saw the films in the 80s, the 90s, or whatever. But the Mr. Vampires, the Chinese ghost stories, and then moving on to the category 3s, everything as we're going to cover. Like these films are really, really important. Pre 2000 and everything. Hong Kong, like the rest of the film industry, was so influential. There were so many classic films which are still loved today. And Hong Kong horror has not been great for quite a while, but now with these developments and stuff, it's very hard to see if the genre will continue in Hong Kong or what form it will take. So it seems a good time to look back at kind of modern Hong Kong horror from the 80s forward, as you said, and everything. And not exhaustively by any means, but just to pick out some of the trends and key films which which have meant a lot to us and have influenced a lot of other filmmakers. I think it's fair to say around the world. So yeah, I think it's, without getting too melancholy, hopefully, I think it's a fitting time to spend Halloween looking back at some Hong Kong horrors.
So I think just before we really get started, I think it's worth setting out a bit of context. And some of this we will come back to in future podcasts. But I think, one thing that I really hadn't thought about before, but it's true, is before the late 60s, you really can't find a lot of Hong Kong horror films.
Yes, yeah.
They're really quite, I think there are, it's not that they're not there, but a lot of them were made for the local Cantonese market in Cantonese language, or black and white. I mean, a lot of cheap production. So therefore, in all sort of various ways, you'd be lucky to kind of be able to find them and access them in any way, shape, or form. I think that some of the stuff that you do think about, does come out of the Shaw Brothers. Most of that, you've got the Enchanted Shadow, which of course is later remade as a Chinese ghost story. But and actually, it's probably the closest of the even the Shaw Brothers side of films for a long time to any kind of proper horror film, because that's definitely influenced by the Hammer, Prince of Darkness, Dracula films. But most of the other films that you see during the 60s tend to be, there might be a ghost, they're definitely on the ghost side of things. And, quite often there might be a Chinese opera, Hongmei opera, and not really what one would be expecting from any sort of ghost or horror film, but it's just they're about ghosts and that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's another thing, I guess, to preface this chat by saying, like you said, like so many of these films, with pre the period we're covering are so hard to see, like pre the Shaw Brothers stuff. But equally, I guess, a lot of these films which we're going to be talking about, aside from some of the big films, like 90s films, anything like that, they're pretty much disappearing already, as we know from our personal attempts to screen them. It's... Yeah. These films
for various reasons, the kind of version you can get hold of, but,
even if you can at all. So it's...
let alone actually get the screening rights.
Exactly. So I think maybe like in another 10 years, 20 years or something, even some of these films are going to be completely inaccessible again. So I think it's a case of if you can, you should try and watch these films. Watch these films while you can, everything, because they're probably not going to be around because nobody really cares enough, and there's no commercial reason to protect or restore or to keep any of these films and everything. Which it's not that we're talking about necessarily classics, some of these films, but a lot of these are possibly lost already, or if not, will be soon to all intents and purposes. So it's which is quite sad in itself, I think. So there's a great body of work there, which we're going to be covering, and which was the periods we're covering as well. I think pretty much everything we're talking about it has that kind of unique Hong Kongness to it as well. That whether it's the sort of chaoticness or the Cantonese language, the swearing, the sort of weird combining of different belief systems because they gave excuses to show different kinds of ghosts and vampires and stuff. Liberal interpretations of Taoism, everything. All that was so Hong Kong. And if this period of films then we're covering, if to a large extent disappears in the same ways like you're mentioning, then it's a real shame for that too. So. But you're right, yeah. I mean, starting this off with the 80s, then absolutely. But then, start of the 80s, we were kind of coming to the sort of the decline of the Shaw Brothers in the form which we kind of knew them in, and
I think it's worth kind of setting that out, because what happens in the 80s, like every decade, it always starts a decade before the film. It was really Shaw Brothers really explored the kind of exploitation side of all the things they were doing, the erotic films, you had really kind of the kung fu genre that they were trying to make happen, and that's when we start to get, as we know them, kind of proper exploitative horror films from Shaw Brothers, particularly, and I guess what happens with those films, and you've got examples that sort of tail into the 80s, like the Hex series and stuff like that, is you do get the like everything else that Shaw Brothers were doing was really basically throwing everything at the wall, So let's talk about some of those, just to kind of get into the 80s with some of the films. So you get to things like Seeding of a Ghost, and Boxer's Omen, and Corpse Mania that are absolutely fantastic. They've taken everything that they were that sort of created in the sort of black magic and all that sort of just dialed it right up to 11.
Oh, absolutely. And those films were... it's like this idea of, like, as you say, throwing everything in, like, the kitchen sink at the wall and everything. But they that seemed to be pushing it in a more graphic sort of direction of horror. Because a lot of those ones, like you said, like Seeding a Ghost, Corpse Mania, I mean, they're, by the standards of any country, the levels of, like, grotesquerie and debauchery and depravity are very creative. I guess we can say and stuff. And it was... somebody wrote like a couple of a really good article in Eastern Kicks about it, which I can't remember who it was, but it's fantastic piece, award-winning, I would say. But no, it's kind of this mixture of, like, I guess, like desperation to try and get these audiences in with this sort of exploitation, shocking content and everything, and the fact that they were kind of irreversibly in decline, kind of at that point, with like Golden Harvest, everything effectively taking over from them. So they were trying desperately to do anything. I think at that point, kind of to bring audiences in.
我现在要用最深奥的巫术，引你老婆的灵魂去找爱过她的人。这种方法就是人人都以为失传了好久的重鬼。你还装什么纯情？保罗，上！
My name is Niina and one of my favorite Hong Kong horrors is Seeding of a Ghost. Directed by Chuang Yang in 1983, it was part of the black magic boom that dominated the Hong Kong horror scene from the mid-70s to the mid-80s. And if you ask me, it is one of the best that subgenre has to offer. It tells a tale of a young taxi driver, Joe Tang, whose life takes an unexpected turn after he helps out a local black magic practitioner. Soon after this, Tang's wife gets raped and murdered by a pair of thugs, and as the local police department is little to no help, Tang decides to call in a favor from the wizard that he helped. With a little help from his wife's corpse, revenge is soon in motion, with the evildoers getting what's coming to them in a form of worm vomit, exploding toilets, terrifying hallucinations, and possession. Basically everything you would want to see in a good black magic film. Like most films in the genre, Seeding of a Ghost plays on the contrast between modern and traditional. Black magic obviously representing the old backwards ways. But it does differ a little bit from its contemporaries in the fact that the black magician is actually not the villain of the story, but even tries to warn the protagonist of the dangers of black magic. Luckily for the viewers, Tang does not listen to these warnings, and what we get is a fantastic trail ride of gross-out special effects and gratuitous nudity. There is cheesy softcore moments involving a wind machine and saxophone soundtrack, as well as a John Carpenter-inspired bloody finale, which is sure to please most viewers. Seeding of a Ghost is the perfect place to start with Hong Kong black magic horror. It contains all the elements you want to see in this genre, and is a wonderful add to anyone's Halloween watch list.
Looking back on it, it's a spectacularly weird body of work from the Shaw Brothers horror stuff in the early 80s, but which we're very lucky we actually, we have, and those are films we still can watch on DVD and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's, any of those are very highly recommended, and it's...
Yeah, and it is something, I mean, like I said before, we will definitely be coming back to a podcast specifically on the Shaw Brothers horrors. But it really does, I think, it whatever you think about those films, they really do set the tone for pretty much everything that comes next, through the 80s and 90s and Category 3.
You do. And I think as well that the other way in which these Shaw Brothers films and the Shaw canon in general sort of sets the scene is the fact that, a lot of these other Hong Kong horror films in the 80s certainly started off more with a historical or period setting. Stuff like, talking about like spooky encounters coming. in 1980, which was the that, and I think that that kind of was very much a move away from the direction Shaw Brothers was going in there. It was it was obviously Samo, and it was combining like the martial arts, the historical setting, with the horror and the humor. So it was a very, very successful. It was a very successful film, but it was a very successful mix of this kind of thing as well. Yeah. And it was kind of like Shaw were kind of, even their martial arts films and stuff in the early 80s were getting pretty weird. No, actually, very weird. Very
Buddhist
weird
Park.
at that point. Yeah.
I mean, they were trying to do all kind of they were trying to bring in all the sort of weird special effects, and sort of Star Wars feeling, and,
Yeah.
Just trying to tick every single box, but quite often miss most of them.
Missing most of them, and what for us looking back now is a really entertaining way. And I guess with Spooky Encounters, like the same as when. Golden Harvest and other companies started getting it, the Jackie Chan films, like Bruce Lee and stuff. They just seem to be, again, sort of building on stuff that Shaw had done, but ahead of the curve, where Shaw didn't really know where they're going with that. So once we had that huge success of Spooky Encounters, it's not even.
It's reasonable to say actually that the whole kind of hopping vampire film started at Shaw Brothers with the Spiritual Boxer.
Absolutely. So they and you're totally right. They set the groundwork for most of the stuff, but then they just didn't manage or were too stubborn to sort of try and go along with these other trends which are becoming more incredibly popular. And Spooky Encounters, it had some of the reasons some of these other films like the Jackie Chan ones and stuff were popular, because Samo and Jackie were more sort of bumbling everyday type figures rather than the Shaw Brothers sort of mighty warriors or stoic.
It was a very and I think that's probably the biggest difference, and that's really is the reason for the success, and the kind of the bumbling innocence really it is so much a part of particularly in the 80s of those films, from the Mist, we're coming onto it, but from the Mr. Vampire series, but even in a Chinese Ghost Story,
absolutely,
Leslie Cheung character who's
no, I completely agree. And it's this more down to earth sort of feeling. But then, I mean, after, despite like Spooky Encounters being such a huge hit, I don't think there were too many other of these before, because Mr. Vampire were sort of mid 80s by then. But there was a few other ones like The Dead and the Deadly and stuff, but there wasn't too many of those other ones like directly sort of following or ripping off, shall we say, Spooky Encounters immediately, say in the next 5 years, give or take. So it wasn't really until we got to Mr. Vampire again where this really took off again, and then obviously Chinese Ghost Story kind of following it, and by that time the sort of supernatural martial arts, supernatural romance, supernatural fantasy,
kind of the waifu era of and very kind of 80s blue, red light, and
exactly.
that kind of stuff, and a bit of a strange kind of incidental bit with ghosts going on at some points. We should get in Mr. Vampire, and we should get all the main theme tune in Chinese Ghost Story. It's kind of the cancer pop really kind of kicks in, I think.
Yeah, that's true as well. We started getting a lot more of the music and a lot of really obviously classic songs,
which is kind of weird. It is actually going back to the 60s genre in a sense, but in a No. But in a proper canto pop way.
Yeah. No, it's completely right. And it was we were seeing another sort of generation of stars coming through then in these films as well. So everything was moving forwards very nicely. And these films were very, especially we said Mr. Vampire and Chinese Ghost Story, hugely successful. And this is where we started, maybe not quite at the time, but we started getting these films over here in the UK as well. Where they were actually getting more international recognition, and not just in a grindhouse way, but were actually getting released and everything. So these films were very popular, which of course immediately led to lots of sequels, and it being Hong Kong, especially at the time, where production was really ramping up in terms of speed. Like so many rip-offs, so many films with confusing names, which are pretty much the same, starring one or other of the stars of these two kind of key films. Especially Joey Wong, who seemed to be in pretty much everything, which was basically similar to Chinese Ghost Story, Picture of a Nymph or Portrait of a Nymph, and all these kind of films, and all these other vampire films following Mr. Vampire, as well as a sequel. Here Comes a Vampire, Vampire versus Vampire, and all these other. I don't know. Maybe the Cantonese titles are slightly different, but there's so many of these films which came out in after the success of these two and everything. And most of them are still pretty fun. Actually looking back on them, there's not really any other ones which hit those heights, but there was enough for this to be kind of the sort of main thrust of the Hong Kong horror industry for the second half of the 80s.
It's so much a part of the culture of this filmmaking, though, that it's really about entertainment, and it's always been in terms of Hong Kong. And I think that's whatever kind of genre it is, and often films that have several genres, it is all about an absolute roar of a time in the cinema. It's not about any kind of pretension. It's just what can we do to make this film more entertaining? Basically, I think that really typifies so many of these films, and I think you particularly see it in the 80s and 90s, and early 90s.
Because they were producing the films, making them so quickly that they were able to cash in on trends very, very quickly. And in that respect, absolutely entertainment. I don't want to say just like cheap targets, but easy, low-hanging fruit, anything like what was entertaining, they could turn it around a lot quicker. So it's not like maybe in the West, like we'd have Armageddon and Deep Impact turning up at the same time. But these kind of things don't happen because you have such a long production schedule getting into it. But in Hong Kong, you could, a lot of the times I've been told do you have a script? No. Okay, well, we'll just start shooting it anyway. We'll figure it out as we're doing the scenes. So you would have all these films coming out. And yes, it didn't always work, but you got some very, very fun and entertaining, if not always coherent films, from this period, which is very enjoyable. And I still look back very fondly on a lot of them. And this kind of continued through. I think when we were getting to later in the 80s, we started seeing some more sort of romance supernatural ones as well. Which I guess took that kind of part of Chinese Ghost Story and then just changed it around with stuff like spiritual love or Rouge is a couple of notches above because it's obviously it's not a cheap exploitation or one, but it's another one with sort of taking the supernatural theme and using it more for like a romance, a sort of a bit more melancholy and everything. But at the same time, we also started getting some ones which still tied back to the Shaw stuff, like The Seventh Curse, which had that kind of black magic. It's amazing film. The kind of precursor, to The Witch from Nepal. And everything. So we still had these kind of like black magic exotic things. So, which I think was probably a result, just some people taking the horror being popular in general. So just, that kind of trend with those two films never caught on quite so much, I think, in the 80s. We still had some real horror, as in man's horror in the 80s and stuff. We still had stuff like The Imp, Dennis Yu, like 1981, which I've seen being referred to as like the first contemporary Hong Kong horror, because most of the Shaw stuff would have been always with a historical setting. Obviously, Spooky Encounters historical setting. So, whereas The Imp it's one of the first ones I can think of. There probably have been others, but dealing with like a security guard in a haunted building, which also has like some relationship trouble, financial trouble, just general uselessness trouble and everything. So it does have some more contemporary themes and. There's a few others floating around, like Possessed 1 and 2, which were kind of Exorcist knockoffs, but with, again, contemporary, but a lot more sort of gore and nudity, bits of weirdness. The odd slasher, like He Lives by Night, but not many. The slasher trend never really went in Hong Kong, especially in the 80s. And then we also saw the kind of rise of Wong Jing and everything with some, which stuff like the Ghost Snatchers.
Which is partly the Seven Curses, part of that as well.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And that is very much the sort of definition of what you were saying of just anything which was entertaining, no matter how lowbrow, and no matter how little sense it actually made, just throwing it all together. But I think he made some pretty good ones. And even if he just produced rather than directed, I still would think of them as Wong Jing films. But The Ghost Snatchers is a really good film. It's very, very funny. It's got the Mahjong ghost in it, which is just a bizarre Muppet. And it's got...
That's right.
Really, and it's got sunglasses.
I think we talked about it on a previous podcast.
We must have done, because it's just...
Yeah, we did. We did one on the Hong Kong comedy
I think we did, yeah. But it's just the Mahjong ghost is burned into my brain, man. But we had that. But I think at that stage we could start to see that things were getting... they were getting what we would think of that kind of like chaotic Hong Kong thing more by the end of the 80s. We were getting more of this kind of mixture of different genres, throwing stuff together, seeing what works. And we started getting a few films which kind of anticipated the 90s a bit more as well, the Category 3 stuff. Like we had stuff like Devil Fetus, Centipede Horror, and everything coming out. And I think probably one of the most important ones would be The Old Men Behind the Sun, in 1988, which was hugely popular and, incredibly graphic.
震惊影坛的黑太阳731揭露了本世纪最残酷、最机密、最不人道的一段历史丑闻。抗战期间，日本军国主义者用活人实验研究细菌武器的真人真事。黑太阳731虽然是本港开埠以来第一部港产3级影片，但也是一部非常正义的3级影片。本片的机密资料来源自美国国家档案局、苏联的日本战犯审判记录、日军残余分子揭露的口供，以及原址现场仍然生存的人员访问。
And it's one of those ones, being about the Japanese, occupation and experimenting and torturing people and everything, World War II. It's one of those ones that I wonder now if you tried to pass that in mainland China, you might get it passed. Just because it's so anti-Japanese. Because some of the sequels for it, I'm not sure if the second one, but 3 and 4 in the Men Behind the Sun series were mainland productions, not Hong Kong productions, specifically for that reason. They're awful, but what's it called? Like the Nanking Massacre, and there's another one which sounds like a guinea pig film, like Laboratory of the Devil type something. And they're no good. But that film was incredibly popular. And I think seeing that kind of extreme content combined with this kind of, I guess it's almost like with what we were getting with the Shaws at the start of the 80s, we started throwing everything at the wall more. We were getting away from those kind of more classic stories like Chinese Ghost Story by the end of the 80s. And when we get to the 90s, then we start seeing a lot more craziness, a lot more wackiness, exploitation and trash, I think, coming onto the scene.
So let's move on to the 90s then.
Yeah, why not? And at the start of the 90s, we were still getting some more of these sequels, like Chinese Ghost Story. Miss the Vampire was still kind of dragging on for a while after we had... I'm surprised...
And also, I think we just into the sort of late 80s, early 90s is Dr. Vampire as well.
Dr. Vampire, yes. Very, very good, fantastic performances, as we know, and everything. No, absolutely. We were getting these wackier versions of it. And a couple of ones which were trying to, if not update the formula, then stuff like Magic Cop, which still had Lam Ching Ying, modern setting, great film, sadly not massively popular at the time and stuff. So I think by the time we were getting into, the odd sort of Chinese ghost stories, some of the bigger budget ones aside, we were sort of losing some of those rip-offs at that stage. And I think a couple of key films I'd highlight then would be like, Erotic Ghost Story in 1990, sort of soft porn Cat 3. And then 92, 93, we had like The Untold Story and Dr. Lamb, which were all, actually very, very popular. So, in the case of The Untold Story and Dr. Lamb, surprisingly well received critically. Again, got some manner of overseas release and not very expensive to make those either. So we had these. This is where, my beloved Category 3, I think we really see sort of coming into the fore, Following the success of those films, and we started getting a lot of more. At first, I guess, separately, maybe like sex films, which were more just like soft porn, or the kind of true crime, lurid, torn from the headline stuff, like Untold Story and Dr. Lamb, which were both, drawn from very loosely, very graphically from real stories. So we started getting those kind of stuff like the Daughter of Darkness films, everything like that, which were quite popular. Lots of different versions of Untold Story, whether it was Secret in My Soup or Human Pork Chop, all these kind of rip-offs and everything. And then we started, there was some of the weirder stuff in Category 3, which was like the Run and Kill, the Red to Kill, Eternally Evil at Asia, Ebola Syndrome, and then on the sex side, we're getting very, very big hits like Sex and Zen. The Erotic Ghost Story films were all big hits and stuff. So the Category 3 stuff was actually, I think it's interesting when we look back at some of these films. Some of them were surprisingly popular, even like on a mainstream level, if not respectable. But they were still actually getting a lot of audiences in, and they were getting quite reasonable releases in Hong Kong cinemas. So we look back at them now, and we see this kind of craziness and this extreme content, which it is. These films are still, pretty pretty shocking, even by today's standards and everything. But at the time, some of these were, they were sort of genuinely, popular productions at the time. I mean, we're talking about the main ones here. There was obviously an undercurrent of really, shabby ones, to be polite about it. Lots of ones which are shot for pretty much zero, and were probably shot just so that the main actor could feel up the actress and everything like that, unfortunately. So there was a lot of crap out there. But it the Category 3, was so popular, we kind of had like a knock-on effect still. So we were still getting a lot of films which maybe weren't rated Category 3, but which were still that kind of trashy stuff, which were coming around by the mid-90s and everything. So I think that kind of 1990 to 95, 96 period and everything was it was still a very, very creative one. We were getting more and more films getting made for lower budgets. Everything was very prolific, but it didn't last massively long. I mean, pretty soon you were scraping the barrel with the Raped by an Angel series and all these other ones, which were just churning out entry after entry after entry to ever decreasing returns. So it kind of ate itself, that kind of Category 3 trash trend and everything like that. And but by the time we got to this sort of mid-late 90s, it kind of burned itself out in terms of actually decent entries in the genre, which is a shame, because it's it's never really been replaced again. But when we were in the mid-90s, there were probably other reasons for that as well. There was a lot of stuff happening. Like we had the Asian economic crisis coming. Film piracy started to become a massive issue in Hong Kong. Yeah, stuff like Jurassic Park was a huge hit. It was just kind of taking over the domestic box office. While on the plus side, they made so many films during these late 80s, early 90s. On the downside, people were getting more and more used to working with these really, really minuscule budgets. And saying, we'll shoot it in a week. And, I was joking before, like, shooting without a script, that kind of thing was happening more and more. So the quality, and I still love a lot of these films, like but the quality nosedived, and there was a good reason for, the decline of kind of the popularity of stuff. But the other thing at the time would be the kind of looming threat of the 1997 handover. You could call it the handover, or you can call it the reunification, depending on how you want to see it and everything. But that was obviously going to be a big, a huge change coming for people. But and you can kind of get an anxiety in some films coming out for it, but it wasn't really that explicitly dealt with on screen by that many films or anything. The kind of worries about the handover and everything, whatever that kind of suggests and stuff. We had a few films about it, like Intruder, which is a Category 3 one, weirdly by Milky Way. So it's actually produced by Johnny To, and it's about like a mainland prostitute kills a Hong Konger, steals her ID, comes to Hong Kong, then targets this lonely Hong Kong guy and just like tortures him for the rest of the film to try and get his ID card for her equally criminal mainland husband. And it's basically a message is communism is evil. But you know what I mean? You would kind of expect more films, especially, horror, we're so used to horror, I guess, in the West being, you can not necessarily successfully or subtly, but you can insert pretty much any metaphor for anything into horror. But there's not very many, or certainly not too many that I'm aware of, were really dealing with that in Hong Kong at the time, which is, I don't know, it's kind of a shame, I guess.
But we do come onto a few later on in this conversation.
A few things come up later and stuff, but I think this, at that stage, was, this was, I guess, when the kind of the death bell was sounding a bit. It was sounding a bit, sort of 1997, and you also had the, Titanic coming out in 1997 was such a huge hit all across Asia, but in Hong Kong, it just wiped out all the other local films and stuff. It was so. These kind of things were so big at the box office, and you still had some local hits floating around like Storm Riders and stuff, but we were seeing Hollywood films really dominating, but at that time, the uncertainty of what I'm going to call it the handover, it was actually going to mean financially, commercially, and everything for people. There's a lot of mixed emotions going around. So it wasn't really, though, a great time for horror. And, we did start to see some stuff still, which is pretty good. Like, we started getting back to more like anthology films. Anthologies had always been pretty popular in Hong Kong. Like, we had quite a lot. Yeah. Even the Shaws made a few. What's it called? Return of the Dead. So I don't remember which year it was, but it was in the 70s. We had quite a lot of them. Then we started getting stuff like the Troublesome Night series, which I still really like. The Troublesome Night, all 19 of them. It stopped being an anthology after part 6, but it was, Herman Yao was directing them, and they were actually pretty good quality. A lot of the entries in there, So I think that was quite a trend as well. Day Doesn't Exist, Midnight Zone. A few years later, we got Haunted Office with Shu Qi. So, anthologies were quite a big thing. We had a few other good films like Biozombie, which is still an amazing film, right? That's one I'd really like to watch that again. Biozombie was one I just wish somebody would remake that somewhere, but still with like a Hong Kong style. Because obviously we have, it kind of takes off Dawn of the Dead and stuff in such a kind of Hong Kong way, instead of like a big shopping mall. It's one of those sort of cool underground shopping arcades with pirate VCD sellers, It's just so 100% Hong Kong that it would be great if somebody, somehow managed to revisit it properly with that same kind of style and energy and stuff. But Last Ghost Standing was a really good one as well. It's kind of like Demons with the plot where they're all in a cinema trapped, and Francis Ng plays a very, very bizarre camp version of the devil. And I can't really describe the plot because there isn't one. It's just a lot of stuff happens, But and that's kind of got some sort of post-handover sort of anxiety, because it's sort of building up to midnight, which you can take midnight as being that kind of that big change for the world coming, and people are very nervous about what's going to happen after midnight. So it was an interesting time at the end of the 90s, but pickings were becoming pretty slim.
And shall we move over to the decade?
Yeah, let's go post-handover then. So, getting to the early 2000s, already we're starting to see, I guess similar to the confusion we have now about the national security law. A lot of people weren't too sure then about the financial and commercial side, especially in making horror films. Because with the opening up that came with the handover, by then, like horror films, or any films rather, were starting to have to appeal to a mainland market if it's all possible. And you had cross-border investment going on and everything. So obviously with the Chinese censors being what they were, and are, and probably always will be, horror films were kind of bottom of the list for investments and everything by that stage, But I think... But
you do start to see the effects of the sort of the J-horror trend,
absolutely,
in particular, and films like Sixth Sense, and
absolutely. Maybe actually even more than that's even more important than the mainland thing. To be honest, Hong Kong, Hong Kong's always, the cinema's always been great at jumping on trends, and absolutely. Ring was 1998, so after that, pretty much every Hong Kong film released, film cover or poster would have someone looking like Sadako. Even if it wasn't that kind of film and stuff, you would have that. You would have that in there with stuff like Wicked Ghost, even like Troublesome Night, which started off pre-Ring. After the success of Ring, it went very Ring, suddenly, which is when Herman Yao kind of left the series. I think he did the first one, which wasn't an anthology, and then he ditched the series because after that, I still like them, but it was sort of a lot more that kind of J-horror type style and stuff. And we had stuff like more direct ones like The Eye then, which were very much in that in that trend, I guess you could say.
And you got the Pang brothers had quite a career, and I mean that film travelled quite well.
The sensation that swept Asia has come to haunt America.
That was part of. That was produced by Peter Chan, and I think we talked about this on previous podcasts. But yeah, he really got into a thing of producing these, let's call them Pan-Asian horrors, and actually making a bit of money out of them because he was seeing this trend for the J horror that was actually reaching Western audiences and actually followed it along very, very well, very successfully. The stuff that he put his name behind, so we get onto anthology series 3 and 3 Extremes.
Yes, yeah.
Or 3 Extremes 2 and 3.
If
you insist on the Western naming of it. But he was behind a lot of those, and including the sort of the feature-length version of Dumplings and stuff like that.
Yeah, and those were, I don't know, it was a nice period, I guess, for a while, because it seemed briefly there was going to be a bit more hope for Hong Kong horror with the Eye and with the 2-3 films, which did travel quite well. I mean, Visible Secret was another big one locally, but it didn't really travel so much. It's all this,
it's much more of Anhui. It's much more of a local kind of ghost story, and it is very much the successor to. Weirdly, it is very much the successor to Spooky Bunch.
Yes, yeah, that's it. But even that didn't travel so much for a while, and after this kind of brief. I guess with 3 films and the Eye, the Pang brothers still churned out a lot of pretty good ones, but there was some Abnormal Beauty, Recycle, Forest of Death and stuff, but then it didn't take too long to drop off into say Fairy Tale Killer, Diary.
Didn't they have they did a US film in between there, and then they started to do lots of films separately. The Messengers,
yeah, that was.
I think that was that before Fairy Tale Killer? I think it might have been because at this point, at sort of the late point, they start to do films separately as well. So you've got Oxide and Danny doing some different films. And I think is it Oxide that does the detective series?
Yes, you're right. Yeah. Oxide did the detective one. Those were pretty good actually as well. I still like some of their films at least. I mean, Fairy Tale Killer, despite what I might have said on the video box, like. ... like Saw or something.
I remember being asked for a quote and I couldn't provide one. I couldn't provide one that I'd be happy to.
I mean, bless them. They did. I was asked if that was okay, and I said, "Yeah, it's fine. I don't mind." I mean, it's a nice sort of taking a sentence out of context, but never mind. It's fine. But it wasn't a good. By that stage, I think the writing was on the wall for them. Which was a shame because they've never really massively come back from it, from that either. So maybe we'll see more stuff in the future. But in general, there was a few other things coming out around then. Like Soi Chang was starting to make some good stuff. Like Horror Hotline, Big Head Monster, which I think that's about the 5th podcast 6 when we've mentioned it.
But it should be your mission just to work it in, but I want you to try and work into it. It's completely inappropriate next time.
challenge accept. I'll just say it. I'll just say Horror Hotline, Big Head Monster. But which again though, that was like influenced by Ring very much, as well as like Blair Witch, which 1999 was a big hit internationally as well. But he was making stuff pretty consistently in the genre then as well, like The New Blood and some other stuff, and we had some other hits, like Inner Senses, Shiver, and stuff. I think previously we talked about that kind of like modern Asian ghost film trend in another podcast, and there was a few good examples of that. But I think these kind of early 2000s is when we could really see Hong Kong horror kind of winding down. And the sadly. Ones which were really sadly, and the ones which were popular were ones which were, I think we were getting into this kind of super watered down period of stuff like the Twins Effect and everything like that, which was this sort of very conservative
Hong Kong Buffy.
Hong Kong. Oh, that makes it sound good though. You know what I mean? These sort of very conservative ones which could, potentially appeal to the mainland market as well. Horror films which didn't really have any horror in them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the kind of the rules, you're not allowed to have ghosts. Some other things you're absolutely not allowed to have. Doesn't leave a lot of options.
No, it didn't. And so, but after that, as you like to call them, the first few years of the noughties. After that, Hong Kong horror, Hong Kong horror as we knew it in the 80s and 90s, I think was pretty dead.
Hi, Stephen Palmer here, and I'd like to talk to you about Hex, a fun little horror from the last knockings of the Shaw Brothers studio released in 1980. It's helmed by Chi Hyung Kwe, who is no stranger to the genre and whose CV includes films like The Killer Snakes and Killer Constable, and plenty of other films without killer in the English title. It's a film in 3 broad parts, 2 more successful than the other. And to be fair, the shocks and sights might be a little tame for the Saw and Hostel generation, but I think it's a fun Halloween treat. The first part of the film is basically a period Chinese version of Clouseau's Les Diaboliques. A consumptive wife called Chan Sao Ying, played by Ni Tian, and another woman called Lung Kei-hwa, played by Tsu Chia Chen, conspire to murder her abusive husband, Young Chun Yu, played by Zheng Wang. Then Young's body goes missing, and of course it turns out that Young and Lung are actually lovers, and that actually fakes his death to scare Chan to death. It's an effective, albeit short version of the story, adding in some detail around Chinese funeral rites to form a solid base. Then the film turns into some kind of screwball comedy, apparently, with the ghost of the murdered Chan exacting revenge on her murderers. This part of the movie seems to turn viewers off, with the wackiness and, let's face it, uniquely Hong Kong humour not sitting well with what it came before and what comes after. But then finally we have 20 or so minutes of astonishing cinema. A witch is hired to drive out the spirit of the dead wife, which initially involves a fully naked woman dancing around, covered in what I can only assume are tattoos designed to ward off spirits. And then the witch spits dog's blood all over her. And then she writes all over a now equally naked Lung, who has her ears ripped off. Those of you familiar with the Hai Chi, the earless segment in the Japanese classic Kwaidan, will know exactly what I mean. And then we have a coda where it is revealed what was really going on in the latter 2/3 of the film. If you paid attention to the opening of the film and one key scene quite early on, it all makes some kind of sense, but I do know plenty of people who can't make head nor tail of things. I'll avoid spoilers, but don't forget to pay attention to the family portraits at the start of the film, and please remember the letter that the travelling salesman was entrusted to deliver. So yes, the scares in this film might be too tame for the modern audience, and that wacky middle section might put you off, but if you sit through it, you'll be rewarded with a magnificent 20 minutes of cinema that will stick with you for days. And we sometimes complain these days that mainland horror films are forced to eschew the supernatural, but I like to think that Hex shows you that you can have the best of both worlds and still remain pretty darn effective.
And shall we move on then to getting into the last decade?
And which we don't have
and I think,
a massive amount to say about.
I mean, it's kind of weird because you do have some resurgences of certain things, don't you? So you do get the sort of you've got masses of films along the lines of Mr. Vampire, like Juno Max, Rigor Mortis, which is just it's a very serious take on it, but there's a lot of fun in there, and I think that's definitely one of those films where actually Cara Hoy really stands out and really kind of made us kind of remade her name as a dramatic actress. Let's put it that way, rather than being my young auntie, isn't it? It's a kind of who when she was doing all the martial arts, really just completely one of the films that really helped remake her career. She's so fantastic, that's true. In that. But then after that you've got, was it Sifu versus Vampire?
Oh yes,
Vampire Cleanup Department.
Nice film, yeah.
You did this. So there's a few that are kind of picking up on old kind of ideas. And again, you kind of come to some of the anthologies like Tales from the Dark 1 and 2, which return to Lillian Lee. The source material.
Of course, yeah, that's true. With Simon Yam as well. Tales from. Did he direct one of them? I think.
I remember the last one,
or maybe part of it.
On part two, on part two, he might have done. But there's the Teddy Robin one, which is actually my favourite one, and he plays the lead character in it as well. It's actually one of the better films in the series. I always thought it would have been. They should have cut it back to being one film with the strongest.
But it's because they were category 3 rated as well. I can't remember why.
His one's quite nasty. It's proper gold school. I think. I remember the terrible one.
I need to watch those again. I do have pretty fond memories of them, but yeah,
like a lot of anthologies, they're a bit patchy.
Not Troublesome Night. Troublesome Night is gold. I'm standing by Troublesome Night. I mean, we could do a great podcast, a very exhaustive 19 films covered in a podcast, or we could do one podcast per episode. I think we would lose our listeners after 3 or 4. But
this is a hardcore would stay with
the hardcore would
both of them.
Well, me and you.
I never listened to the podcast.
Shame. But no, we also had like Hong Kong Ghost Stories, which wasn't too bad, an anthology. Always Be With You, which was Troublesome Night. I think it was intended as a Troublesome Night reboot, but which just didn't unfortunately go anywhere. So we still had some. And
I guess also kind of on the sort of the bringing back the sort of old school. You've got the Herman Yao kind of carrying on and doing things like Gong Tao, and then sort of Sleep Curse and stuff like that. He's kind of, very much kind of keeping to his, what he's known for, and like particularly with Gong Tao, kind of returning to that sort of old school black magic.
I do like it very much, but yeah.
I mean, one of the other films I really love of this period, would be Dream Home.
Yeah.
I just think it's such it's a really inventive, quite horrible in the way that some of the people are killed off kind of film, but incredibly just a beautiful social satire as well. It's just, I mean, everything about that.
I think that's one of the, not just as a horror fan, but I think that's one of the best Hong Kong films of the new millennium. Where you can, say, and even just one of the best modern films actually about Hong Kong. In there as well. I mean, like you say, like the social commentary in there, everything, but actually managing to bring that together with, as you said, it is super gruesome, especially like it was category 3 rated in Hong Kong, but it was cut in Hong Kong. And the version we got over here was not cut in the UK, bizarrely. Same for old Revenge a Love Story, which is not a horror film, but that was cut in Hong Kong, even though it's category 3, and we got the full version for what it's worth. So there was a few films, but I mean that's pretty much exhausted a decade or so with what kind of we've just listed off. There weren't very many of these, and a lot of these weren't massively popular. unfortunately, either. So they were sort of more. I think stuff like Rigor Mortis, whatever, Vampire Cleanup Farm, done, I think partly because, God bless the Juno Mack and the fellow who did Vampire Cleanup, but genuinely fans of it, who are doing it partly for the love of it, trying to bring it back and stuff. So it's a shame these films weren't that successful. And so some of the other ones which were surprisingly successful is a few of these fake documentary ones, like The Cases 1 and 2, The Unbelievable, stuff like that, where you're kind of like fake horror ghost reporting stuff, which I think are really great, but they were successful locally and of course went nowhere else at all because no one else is going to either believe it or really care too much about it.
So let's bring it right up to date. What is the future? What is the future of Hong Kong horror?
Oh.
As we've said, it's not looking good.
No, it's not looking
Prognosis
good,
negative.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, at the moment, we still have like it's kind of a small batch of ones which were, I guess, were shot over the last couple of years or even in the last 2-3 years and not come out due to COVID. So, stuff like Coffin Homes, for example.
Yeah.
That one with a really long name, which doesn't mean Hellbank or something running.
Hellbank presents Running Ghost.
That's it.
Who is this Hellbank? Why are they presenting it? Are they also presenting Peninsula Byway? No.
Exactly. So, Sugar Street Studio. That's the other one. So I don't know.
And there are a few others as well, but yeah.
There's not many of them. Everything. Much. So I honestly I think.
I mean, who would? I mean, if you were in the. I mean, even before the last 6 months or so, Sumatra 6 months or so, I think you would be really hedge. You want to be hedging your bets and not taking a gamble on producing a horror film.
Yeah, because it's. I mean, and you still.
And you would even. I mean, I remember when I interviewed Philip Young about Port of Call, which again is a category film.
That's right.
And actually, it's quite gruesome in places.
It is. Yeah.
He was like, "Well, I've made this film, and I know it's not going to travel to the mainland. There's no chance." And it's like I made a home movie, basically, and
and he's not having a great time with his most recent film either.
No.
Which
I think it is starting to emerge, but there's been a few trailers.
Whatever they've done to it, yeah, exactly. So after it was so unceremoniously yanked from the opening night of the Hong Kong Film Festival, but I don't know. I think it's this uncertainty because we've mentioned in some other stuff before. I mean, we've seen like mainland producing not horror films, but online stuff like that The Enchanting Phantom and whatnot and stuff like that. So,
which is kind of weird because is it that the stylized ghost story is now okay?
Well, I think it's mostly that the online censorship isn't currently at the same level as the cinema. The cinema
bound to change.
It's going to change, absolutely.
If it hasn't, considering how.
Yeah.
Without this podcast getting too political, but considering how much of a clampdown there is on everything online now.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. It's probably we come to look back in a few years fondly on The Enchanting Phantom. Those were the days, the great days of freedom. But no, I completely agree. It's whatever Hong Kong has always been such a creative place for making films. I think if there were actual set in stone rules, then people would find a way to work with them, work around with them, and would do something. But now, it's just you have no idea what's going to happen, and which is the situation in the mainland most of the time anyway. Like the rules can change on a daily basis without you being told. You can green light a film, get the script approved, get your production approved, get your shoot approved, edit approved, and suddenly yanked from cinemas because the rules have changed in the last 2 years. So
2 weeks, yeah.
or you didn't bribe the right person, but yeah. So for Hong Kong horror, I mean, we hope for the best with this because we even in this sort of very rapid fire run through, and man, I'm sure there's a million other films we could have mentioned with great affection. There's so much of an incredible body of work from the 80s and the 90s. Even the sort of lower quality stuff, the rip-offs, and so many of these films, I still managed to find like something endearing or enjoyable about these ones, man. Which I think, I always prefer Cantonese to Mandarin, but that, whether it's the swearing or just the sort of local color and flavor which comes out in these films and stuff, man. Even though, I fully accept that we're probably getting half the jokes because of the quality of subtitles we're used to. Which are actually funny in their own way and everything, like "damn you fathead," or that's a different level of comedy itself. But I can't see it ever going back to those days. And everything has to evolve and move forward and stuff. But there's a difference between if Hong Kong horror was evolving into something new. It's always going to be commercial, very ruthlessly ripping off stuff and throwing stuff together. It would always have that quality, but there's a difference between it doing that and sort of developing or evolving or devolving into something, or just basically being in this kind of complete limbo at the moment without too much hope for the future. And I don't see anything other happening than Hong Kong coming under the same sort of rules and regulations.
It's a bit of a sad thought to kind of leave us on, but one of the most horrific films of recent times was 10 Years.
Yes,
and it didn't even take 10 years for it to happen.
Boom. Yeah, no, you're quite absolutely, you're quite right, and obviously, we always knew these things were going to happen, but it's happened so suddenly, and I don't know how a film industry, especially the genre side of things we're talking about, I don't know how that kind of adapts in that short space of time. So, and for what that means for the horror industry, I guess we'll have to see. But hopefully, if nothing else, we won't start seeing this rigorously applied retrospectively, because I guess pretty much all the films we've just talked about wouldn't pass muster, in that respect. I don't think there's too many that would pass the old censorship stuff, and I understand that to an extent. This is a sort of kind of Westerners, outsiders looking at stuff, because from like a mainland Chinese point of view, they're just used to using VPNs, and they're like, well, it didn't get released officially, it doesn't matter, we'll just watch it anyway on the VPN. So for us, it's more just complaining from our sort of our position over here, and thinking like, hopefully these films will still get made and stuff, and hopefully these older ones won't get banned and stuff, because we'll still have ways to watch them. But it's just it's just a shame, because I think it's great how international the Korean genre is, whether it's on the TV with the Squid Games and stuff, or a lot of the films which are still uniformly getting to film festivals. That's great, but Hong Kong horror is always going to have such a place in our hearts, I dare say, that seeing it without too much hope for the future is it's just a shame. But maybe it will come back from the very grave somehow as a ghost haunting people, haunting the censors.
That's it for now. Don't forget you can find all of our previous episodes on Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe now and you'll never miss an episode. But for now, as a toast to Hong Kong horror.
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers to you.